of Toitu Envirocare. I'm the public sector program lead here, and I'm very pleased to introduce today's webinar, which is developing a carbon reduction program, which I'm sure is a topic near and dear to everyone's hearts. Either you've been working on one for years and need new ideas, or you're just starting out and need ideas. And so we've invited Tony Salem and from the University of Canterbury to talk about their experience working on this over the last, well, decade or so. Also accompanying him is Steve Penny, who is Director of Honoris, who have been assisting University of Canterbury with their program since 2015. And also Graham Dray, Investment and Engagement Group Officer for the public sector, who provides a lot of assistance to the public sector with developing emissions reductions programs, including the University of Canterbury. So very shortly, I'm going to hand over to our speakers. Just to explain the drill, please put your questions into the Q&A box. My colleague, Kenzie Pinkman, will be monitoring that box, and then at around about 10:40, we'll go into question time, where she'll be reading your questions out for our speakers to answer. And yeah, and she'll close us out as well. So it's my great pleasure to introduce Tony Salem, who's a building services engineer with 45 years experience. And he has been working at the University of Canterbury for the last 12 years on their program, and grappling with, well, first measurement and then reduction of their carbon emissions. Accompanying him is Steve Penny, who has over 35 years experience in building services consultancy and has been brought on to, and for several years has been assisting Tony with developing the low carbon campus plan. So without further ado, Tony, please take the floor.
Right, how are we doing? Are you getting me loud and clear?
We certainly are.
Oh, that's great, Jake. Thank you for that. Right, affirmation enough, and I thank you very much for that introduction. I'd like to say, Asamaria, good morning to everybody. I understand there are a few of you out there mad enough to listen in. And I'd like to firstly say that obviously any resemblance that I pay to Ned Flanders is purely coincidental. Anyway, I've been with the university since 2009. I've been focusing on measuring and managing, and particularly carbon, how appropriate, starting with the CMARS scheme back then. So obviously, as far as Toitu was concerned, it was Monarchy Whenua Landcare Research. So 2010, we kicked off with the CMAR scheme, and for those who don't know the acronym, it's Certified Emissions Measurement and Reduction Scheme. I did the consultant course at that particular time and could compare with what I'd seen back in the UK, and I was quite prepared to embark on that one. So actually, today's presentation obviously is how to develop a carbon reduction plan. Well, firstly, obviously, we did the measure, and the subsequent manage part was the low carbon energy scheme, with firstly the feasibility study, and then subsequently the roadmap strategy. And I know Jake has eloquently told you about the other two gentlemen that are going to be sort of sharing the floor. But I'd like to sort of firstly pay tribute to Steve for his longevity, actually, but for obviously being with us over that period. Steve has provided what one might consider to be the consultancy background, and obviously the answers to the questions that were posed by the university, and there's been a collaborative response between both organisations. Equally, from Graham Dray's perspective, Graham and Ika have been stalwarts as far as providing us with funds, providing us with the capability to produce the feasibility study and the roadmap strategy, but equally a whole host of other things around that, technology demonstrations, design advice, energy audits, etc. So both gentlemen very welcome and very apt that they're here. So without further ado, we will move on to the agenda. Great, here we are. What I'd like to do first, kick off with some contextual stuff, because under the circumstances, and you'll know probably about the university, you might have some idea if you've been here of the size of it. It was originally likened to being about the size of Ashburton. That's when I arrived. So that was 2009. I think Ashburton's grown somewhat since then. Anyway, backdrop, energy usage, and then I'd like to talk about how the earthquakes affected the university, our campus master plan, and how that started to decide what we needed to do to respond and recover, and basically to create an environment where teaching and research could again begin from a world-class perspective. I'd like to then move on to carbon emissions reduction. So looking at the why, the where to start, obviously CMAS, the what, the how, and who can help. And at that point, I'll be passing over to Graham Dre first. And Graham's got some bits and pieces that I think he'll probably be talking about, which might sort of focus around the Energy Transitions Accelerator, which has some good bearing on the situation that we've had here with both the interaction between ourselves and also Steve and the consultancy. So to obviously move in that particular direction. And then I'll pass back over to Steve Penny, and Steve will look at some points to consider. So perhaps adding a bit more of the technical aspect to what I've already sort of detailed. So firstly, the backdrop. So forgive me for a second, I'll just get a laser pointer so that everybody can see. Apart from me waving my arms around, they'll be able to see what I'm talking about. Effectively, we have the university here, and typically a cartoon bone shaped, if you like. Here we have Dovedale, which is one of our campuses, running through Island Fields and then back out and around this area here, which is the University of Canterbury Island campus. So that's about 87 hectares. Back in 2010, the gross floor area was about 271,000 square meters. At that time, probably about 250 buildings and about 15,700 students. Moving forward 10 years, we have slightly less students and slightly less in terms of our campus, but obviously during that period we'd lost some buildings to demolitions, and subsequently we built back, but with an idea of producing a campus that was going to be indeed world-class and encourage those stakeholder students back to us. So electricity, again, we're working with back in 2010, but I will add some 2020 figures as well. About 31 million kilowatt hours. So from an energy perspective, 113,000 gigajoules approximately, and about 4,300 tons of CO2 equivalent. On the coal side, you'd appreciate that there was going to be perhaps a lot more CO2 equivalent, but equally we had quite a bit more in terms of the energy required at that particular time, and that's probably got some good bearing on some of the changes that we've made with new buildings up until now. So as you can see, 6,300 tons of coal, which was approximately 40 million kilowatt hours, and 145,000 gigajoules, but obviously notably 16,000 tons of CO2 equivalent. So particularly what one might say, an asset in coal that really ought to remain stranded. And obviously we're moving down that line to deal with that particular problem. So, right, the backdrop again, earthquakes. What more can I say? If one looks at the left-hand side of the screen, that was one of our office buildings that was associated with Parker James Height, which is the library. everything came down. There were some very significant issues that came about. This was the 2011 earthquakes. Some of the 2010 created problems, but they weren't so bad. The 2011 earthquakes caused more damage, being very much more significant. I think it was described as a strike-slip event, an extremely high peak ground acceleration, which was exacerbated by there was a horizontal and vertical components, but there was also something called seismic lensing, which basically reverberated back off the hard basalt of the Port Hills. Excuse me. And in consequence, we had some very significant damage, no loss of life, thankfully, not directly. There was unfortunately one person who was working in town at the time and was in the fated, unfortunate building. So looking at signage, as you can see here, it was sufficient to break foundations. As I say, we had very significant damage. We had lots of remediation to do, and we found ourselves in a position where we needed temporary classroom facilities. And I was the logistics manager on the emergency operations center that had to sort that out. So under the circumstances, it was a case of tents out on car parks. Thankfully, the weather was kind to us. Students were stalwarts, as you can see here. Dear Earth, you really think that was going to stop us? Bless them. You know, they came back in their throngs and continued to support the university whilst we were trying to work our way through it. The initial part, the response was, you can see a number of buildings here. We spent 28 million within the first few days in getting these temporary classrooms up and running, and we had 100 of them, basically on both campuses to accommodate teaching research. Then moving on, the campus master plan. Needing to actually develop those facilities, we set to, obviously the remediation, but subsequently we needed to improve to create that world-class teaching environment. And this master plan lended itself entirely to a low carbon energy scheme. In other words, we had the buildings, we knew what we needed in terms of teaching research, but we needed a built environment infrastructure that would accommodate that, and a roadmap strategy that would subsequently take us on to deliver it. So thankfully, the help was available to us with Steve. All we needed to do was ask the questions. So carbon emissions reduction, why? Well, firstly, why would you? It's the right thing to do. We know it's the right thing to do. We've heard about code reds recently, but we're probably in a large sort of group of individuals who are knowledgeable about this and obviously can push in that direction. But reputation under the circumstances from an organizational perspective is very important. And from that, corporate social responsibility and environment, social and governance. These need to foster a positive impact and to create an environment that people can see from the outside that this organization knows what it's doing. Well, okay, what do we do then? Well, we've got our reputation, we're considering that. How do we enhance that reputation? Well, set some standards and targets. What's important to your organization? You might be a commercial organization, you might be a government organization. From a government perspective, there's a lot of capability, there's a lot of horsepower coming to fruition now to push us in that right direction. Perhaps not too much commercially, but one would hope that there will be things that will start to factor in that will provide that push. So financial considerations, okay. And what have we considered? Well, certainly, you can't ignore fossil fuel considerations. The costs are increasing. I think I saw the other day that we're approaching $50 a ton for carbon. And so that makes a compelling argument in itself. But we are with the Climate Change Commission and with the push that was probably enabled going right back to the Productivity Commission report, we'd identified that there needed to be an increasing cost on carbon. Punitive, one might say. Others would say that it's focusing, it's making for behavioural change, it's focusing people's energies. Subsequently, well, regulation under the circumstances, having mentioned the government, the carbon neutral government program. Well, it's a long-term program to show government leadership. It's measure, it's verify, it's set gross emissions targets, it's introduce phased work program to reduce emissions, its offset, and it's to achieve carbon neutrality. The Prime Minister was also on record as saying, which was great in terms of empowering organisations to get out there and do some emissions measurement to put together, let's just say, call it carbon reduce, put together your emissions inventory. If you can measure, you can manage. Subsequently, something that's been going around from a commercial organisation perspective, TCFD. This was put together, I think it was a conglomeration or a cumulative effort actually within G20. They have something called the Financial Stability Network, and between two individuals, gentleman who was the then governor of the Bank of England, it was Mark Carney, and also Michael Bloomberg, another financial pundit stroke plaudit under the circumstances for these reasons. They put together this task force on climate related financial disclosure. Mark Carney had been doing a number of speeches in his capacity, but was talking about aspects of the costs on future generations and how we dealt with the problem. He was looking at the materiality aspects and wanting to actually make sure that organisations could represent themselves in the best possible way. So in other words, if you can identify what your risk is, you can best present yourself to the market, but equally you can do something about the problem, but you need to recognise it first. So that's where the TCFD came from, and that started around 2015. I think it got reinforced in 2017, but just recently, as we can see down here, the G7 have agreed so-called historic steps to make this climate reporting mandatory. G7 have agreed it. It looks like COP26, the G20, will probably reaffirm that in Glasgow in November. So that's great. The focus is there. It's already with big banks, that, excuse me, the big four accountancy companies, and I think 1,700 companies all around the globe. Excuse me, taking a slurp. And in consequence, we, as in New Zealand, are the first cab off the rank. The bill's just gone through Parliament, and the reporting is going to be made mandatory here for organisations. I think we're probably talking about 1 billion in asset or a financial organisation. But what we're talking about is the mandatory climate-related financial disclosures bill. It will mean that reporting will need to be ready for 2023, so working through 2022. Again, organisations identifying their risk, identifying themselves to potentially investors or their stakeholder in general. And the final one I'd mention in terms of regulation really is the NCCRA, which is the National Climate Risk Assessment Framework document. Now, this, under the circumstances, has come out relatively recently. It provides, it's basically from the MFE and Stats New Zealand. It's a framework that provides a means to evaluate risks and opportunities and climate change, obviously, in terms of that, the nature, the severity, the urgency, using a wide range of different sources to actually put that together. So it will be certainly something that can be presented across the board within organisations to actually identify the what's, if you like. Right, carbon emissions reductions, where to start? Well, with me, as I've already said, it's quite obvious, and I would imagine a lot of you out there will have moved this well-trod path. Carbon reduce. When I kicked off, as I said, it was Menarche Fenner and Landcare Research, and that was back in 2010. And I thought it was an excellent tool. I probably said that as well. So under the circumstances, having moved along that line, on screen, what we've got here is the pie chart of the emissions from the university. Hopefully that's reasonably legible, but it shows the greenhouse gas in tons of CO2 equivalent, and also the percentages alongside it. So it's just looking at all of those individual components, and it's quite it's a compelling document or compelling graph. something you can put in front of people and they can understand immediately what the university is producing and where it's coming from, which obviously measure and obviously then manage under the circumstances. And as you can see from the big brown semicircle there, that was coal back in 2010. Obviously, high-level buying, really important. Those of you who've trodden the path, that means that you've got to actually take it to those people that have the financial capability, who had the leadership within the organisation to get that buy-in. With me, interestingly, it was the Climate Change Commissioner, Rod Carr, was the VC here at that time. And so he and I had a few discussions about various things, carbon, CMARs being one of them at a particular time. So it was convened with our senior management team, or senior leadership team as we call them now, with the idea of discussing and obviously getting their buy-in. Now, from the perspective of the university, as you can see, there's air travel and other details in here. There are some aspects about those that perhaps one would imagine a university or an organisation would be reticent to actually pass on. I think from a public disclosure perspective, Rod was very supportive and wanted to actually identify, well, okay, here it is. It is an institution that needs to travel, but obviously it needs to actually identify what it actually does and present that. And so thankfully we got buy-in. So it was great. Chance to move on. They bought in. So there we were, measured. Right, carbon emissions reduction, the what? Well, under the circumstances, excuse me, I'm sure you will all be looking around. You've probably mostly identified what potentially was low-hanging fruit. You've possibly started to get stuck into some of the other areas which which have a far more major implication, but might obviously be reliant upon a bit more traction and a bit more push with regards to cost and being able to look at that particular element. Well, obviously, as we can see, it sort of mimics where we're going from the university, but it doesn't actually show where we're going to be ending up. So we are at present with coal-fired boilers. We will be moving to biomass fuel as an interim measure. It was considered that we'd go various ways as part of the feasibility study. We were looking at what would be appropriate, and we'll show a diagram a bit later that actually identifies from a carbon perspective and a cost perspective what was the way to go, and also a document identifies from a traffic lights perspective why, for all of the reasons, cost, risk, etc., why we went that route. But the idea was that we've got buildings that are of a lesser thermal integrity, and we still needed to provide a higher temperature means to heat those. And in consequence, we are going through an interim phase with using biomass, but eventually we're working down the line. We've already got ground source heat pumps and renewables, but we are going to be in a position where we completely remove combustion entirely, and we remove boilers, and we go completely to ground source heat pumps, so electric renewable. So that's sort of the direction. So again, from your perspective, consider these things. I'm sure you already have, and will probably have the low-hanging fruit underway, and some of the larger stuff you'll be perhaps wanting to move on the lines of. But again, consider reduce energy demand. Those of you who know about the the International Energy Agency, they identify the first fuel for any organization as being energy efficiency. So in other words, if you can make your environment far more efficient, you're going to be saving money, you're going to be saving carbon. That's the way to go. And thus the diagram that you'll see in the bottom right, it talks of energy efficiency first. It's a hierarchical diagram, really. So it's talking about energy efficiency first and making those savings. It then goes on to more efficient supply of energy. So, for example, sort of new boilers and better lighting and controls. And then finally talks about the renewables. So replacement of conventional fossil fuel supplies of energy with renewables or lower carbon fossil fuels. So switching from perhaps coal to gas, or with our particular circumstances, it's coal to biomass, and subsequently we'll be moving on to entirely renewable electricity from those sources that we know about, wind, water and sun. Also mentioned at the bottom here, climate change risk register. We've just produced ours. Again, there is a focus here to enable the organisation to understand whose responsibility things are and what might transpire if certain things get out of sync, out of kilter, out of hand. So from a physical perspective, from a financial perspective, equally from a reputational perspective, you know, I suppose you look at a university, we are reliant upon our stakeholder. Our stakeholder is the student to a great degree, also the staff. So we would want to make sure that those stakeholders are aware of where we're going, aware of what we're doing, and that we've got corporate governance. Just as an aside, we've conducted some surveys within the university over the past 6 to 8 years with the idea of saying to the student, well, what is on your minds and what do you consider to be one of the major considerations of coming to the university? What do you think problems would the problems that would sort of motivate you the most? And reducing carbon emissions has come up top on 2 out of those 3 occasions, not least of which the last 2. So the stakeholder is very motivated to make those reductions, I'm pleased to say. So moving on, sorry about the blank. The carbon emissions reduction, the how. We've talked about emissions inventory, where you then start to bring together the work that needs to come and who's responsible. An emissions management reduction plan. Probably what I didn't mention was, as far as CMARS is concerned, and perhaps a lot of people would know, there is a reduction element to this. And so to have a reduction plan is absolutely necessary. We agreed in the first 10 years from 2010 to 2020 that we would sort of mimic what the government was doing or what the government was detailing in terms of its nationally disclosed commitments. And under those circumstances, we were talking about 20% below 1990, I think the government were talking about. We looked at a 20% beyond when we started to measure. So from 2010 onwards, we actually made better than 25%. So we were quite pleased. And this is without our major projects. So this was looking at things like improving control. So the fossil fuels element, following the significant emission sources on the slide, the fossil fuels, looking at air travel, refrigerants, making reductions with those as far as the Kyoto Protocol is concerned, and the Kyoto Agreement, making sure that we were moving down the right lines to make the change. Specific emissions reduction projects, as I've said, that's where we were working to provide those replacements, to look at and detail and identify who was responsible within the organisation. So principally myself, but a number of my colleagues, because I work within a facilities management environment, and we do have our own directly employed GPs, electricians, fitters, etc. And then obviously going back to the emissions management reduction plan to record that performance. And as I say, at the end of 2020, we were more than 25% down on our agreed targets, which we were very pleased about. So the carbon emissions reductions, who can help? Well, it just so happens we've got 2 gentlemen that are sitting in the wings at the moment. But suffice it to say, before we get to them, I'll just detail the way that we actually got our reports and the roadmap strategy sorted. Firstly, as you can see, the document here, the request for proposals, this was one that I put together before I went to market through GETS, the government electronic tendering system. That identified effectively the questions. What I was looking to do was the costs and benefits of decarbonising the UC, along with whether the UC should own and operate that solution. You see just here, there's a large flue, that's the university. Essentially, that could have been a direction that we could have gone in, is to get someone else to actually build it and run it for the university, and we buy the output. So that was contained within the request for proposal. So that went out. Steve and his consulting organisation then responded to that, along with a number of others. I think I had 10 at the original RFP presentation, where I was talking about what the university was looking for and subsequently what it wasn't. Steve put together by far the best response and subsequently came to the fore with a number of his team to produce the low carbon energy scheme feasibility study, which you see, which is the document with the large boiler house flue on it. That was, I suppose one might say, it was a document that was answering questions. It was providing a basis for our direction. It was subsequently needing to perhaps look at, it was looking at the aspect of the direction really, and it was providing some low carbon reviews, it was providing costs, and it was subsequently something that needed to be taken into a phase 2. Which was the low carbon energy scheme roadmap strategy. Now, this was an analytical document and is. Life cycle costs have gone into it, carbon has gone into it, looking at particular design aspects around the university, pipe workflows, building energy requirements, and also timeline. And the idea with this document was to present a no surprises cost data plus information that could be taken and used by not only ourselves, but obviously presented through to our senior management team. And that's the way it went. Obviously, there was a peer review process, and between the feasibility study and the start of the roadmap strategy, which is this phase 2 document, we went through peer reviews, and there was a couple of them, one between feasibility study and roadmap strategy, and one post the roadmap strategy, just to make sure that all of the data that we were collecting, all of the information, all the calculations and all the direction was fair, reasonable, and had turned out in a way in which would be deliverable under the circumstances. So with that in mind, we then have subsequently business cased those implementation projects, and thinking particularly now about ground source heat pumps, eventually the way we're moving, but we're also working on that right now, along with our boiler replacement, or excuse me, our boiler fuel replacement. So those are in the process of being moved on. We do have some assistance there, and we're very pleased to say that ECA have afforded us a great deal of assistance to move us down this line. But obviously we do have some government assistance in terms of funding for this project. So we're very pleased about that, that people have seen what we've done and have been in approval of it and prepared to actually back it. So at that point, if I can pass on now to Graham, Dre and Eka, and Graham can provide some background.
Lovely, thanks Tony. I hope everybody can hear me. I still get a little bit phased out by noise cancelling headphones and trying to speak at the same time, because I always think I'm speaking far too loudly. But thank you for that, Tony. And good morning to everybody, and thank you for taking the time out today. We had a 15-minute session before we went online, and somebody said there was like 5 million people on this webinar, so I wasn't quite expecting that. So welcome to everybody. I think it's about 450 actually, but there you go. So in context of this, I'm going to be talking mostly around the public sector space. So my role here at ECA, I've been here 6 years and working in the public sector space. Helping government organisations reduce their energy, and I guess the last few years has been all about carbon and reducing the carbon emissions. There's no slides from me today because we've done a number of these presentations recently, of which some of you may have attended those. So I'm just going to talk to you for a little bit for the next 5 minutes and just really explain about I guess a little bit about University of Canterbury, but also more importantly, how we can help others in the same area, in the same situation, to help decarbonise, I guess, their assets, etc. So without further ado, I guess ECA's been working with University of Canterbury since 2015, June 2015, and myself has been working predominantly with Tony and others for about the last year and a half as their account manager. My role is essentially in ECA to help government organisations reduce their energy and also alongside that their carbon emissions. So a lot of the work that Tony has been explaining, and thank you also Tony, because I think work for ECA now, you did an excellent job of explaining exactly what ECA does and what's there as assistance. So I'll cover that off as well. So as I say, about the last year and a half, I've been working with University of Canterbury, and I guess I've helped them in the state sector decarbonisation area, which I'll talk about as well. The university's low carbon plan was, I guess, really a good introduction for ECA to look at how the university's approach could actually work on a wider scale. And so a few years ago, we set up what we call the Energy Transition Accelerator program. And this is one of ECA's flagship programs for large energy using public sector organisations. We also extend that out to the private enterprise as well. But essentially, it's a very high level summary of your organisation and the way that it's run and your assets, etc., with the aim for committing to reducing carbon emissions. Essentially, that process is that those organisations who sign up to that has an expert to help you on that long-term pathways to emissions reduction, and that's by identifying technically and economically viable decisions and investments. So it's a long-term look, but also it covers very much the short-term opportunities that are available within your organisation, and to say that's aimed at the larger organisations out there. We run that program on the back of a number of suitably qualified providers, and we've got a program where those chosen program partners have been set up on a panel, and the organisation who wishes to embark on that can take a look at those organisations and choose which one they would like to embark with. It's usually done by I guess a mini RFP style look at things, and essentially when you feel comfortable with an organisation that can deliver what you want as overall, then that's usually the time when you go with that program partner. Like all of our programs, there's co-funding, and that Energy Transition Accelerator program is no different. So there is co-funding for that. Usually when we provide funding, there's a requirement from you as an organisation. Usually that is in kilowatt hours, but there is also a carbon component on some of these programs as well. So in terms of other help, and we've got a number of programs, and some of you may have heard this before because we've done a number of webinars, etc., certainly in the last 3-4 months. So apologies if you've heard it before, but I guess there's a lot within that 450 odd that haven't heard this before. ECA's out there, and we have a number of programs that offer co-funding. One of those is Crown Loans. So that's an interest-free, I call it a loan for now, but it's not because there's no APR in that. Essentially, it's a one-off flat rate procurement fee, and also depending on how much organisations decide to take, the fee differs slightly, but essentially one-off flat fee of $500 for loans up to $50,000 and 1% for loans above $50,000. So there's $2 million annually that sits there for, I guess, what we class as mainly capital expenditure, which is ECA's only program on that one, and that small fee there is to cover ECA's establishment and loan administration cost. ECA runs that program, we administer it, make sure payments come in on time, etc., and that can be up to 5 years for organisations to take advantage of that. As Tony's mentioned, there's things like audits, optimisation, feasibility studies, business plans, design advice, monitoring, targeting, and one that's particularly popular, I guess, is the Energy Graduate Support Scheme. So ECA co-funds that program for up to 2 years. And I guess lastly, but very importantly, is the state sector decarbonisation fund, and I think Tony alluded to that towards the end of his presentation there. So this is a fund which has been set up by government. It's $219.5 million for public sector, and ECA administers the fund on behalf of the government. So essentially that is for large scale carbon reducing work, and the whole idea of the fund is that government are looking for programs, that pieces of work that you as organisations were looking to do maybe in 2028, 27, and bring those forward to the current day. So the government's funding is to help organisations bring those projects forward to now, which decarbonises the country's estate quicker than it would do normally. So the investment focus on that is things like replacing fossil fuel boilers in hospitals and tertiary institutions with low emissions alternatives such as biomass boilers and heat pumps. We also work with Ministry of Education to replace their coal boilers into schools. It also covers replacing vehicle fleets with electric vehicles, not hybrids, and installing energy efficient chillers and LED lighting as other priorities. I won't go too much into the detail of that, and quite happy to answer that, I guess, probably out of this forum, because it could take quite a while to go through questions on that, but quite happy to answer that later on. So ECA provides expert advice there in terms of technical support and facilitates low emissions energy investments. So from our perspective, it's getting obviously best bang for buck, but making sure that the right decisions are being made in terms of what replacement fuels are about. So I guess in summary, and to say Tony did an excellent job as an ECA account manager there, but Tony alluded to, I think, in that presentation that there's now reporting from a government perspective, and I'm sure we're all aware out there that everybody's got to be reporting on their emissions, and obviously there's targets out there for 2025 and then 2026 for vehicles as well in the government fleet. I guess our key message in all of this is, look, you know, if you haven't started, you need to do it now. You know, point in case when you're looking at vehicle replacements and you're looking at, you know, leases or even owned vehicles, you know, if you're looking at leases, you've already only got one cycle of lease left for most companies to achieve the aims for 2026. So it's just a case in point. And really, you know, there's a lot of organisations out there that we're talking to that just haven't got a plan about what they're going to do, how they're going to do it, and when they're going to do it for. So the fact that there's reporting out there, and obviously Toy2 is there in that space as well. You know, you need to have a plan about what you're going to do. And Tony mentioned that, you know, that, you know, they had a plan about what they were going to do. And I guess, you know, that's where we can help, and where also Steve can help as well. But if you don't have a plan, you know, I think you're not getting there. The other thing is that, you know, ECA's very well positioned in this space now to help in your energy / carbon journey. Very much, you know, we've been doing it for a long time, certainly with the state sector decarbonisation fund. It's sort of, it's a little bit on steroids at the moment with everything that's going on and the inquiries that we're getting. So very much, you know, we can help co-funding, help advice. A lot of organisations that we are currently dealing with have done this journey before. You know, they've started the journey. And so if you're thinking about how do I do it, you know, we can offer advice about how to do that, what organisations have done it before. Can we help you with shortcuts to get to where you want to? Because, you know, we're 2021 now.
Excuse me, Graham.
Sorry? Yep.
Sorry, we're running out of time now,
Cool.
and I'm just mindful that Steve hasn't had a chance to speak.
No
so
problem.
We'll just close off that section now, and we'll move quickly to Steve.
Absolutely. Thanks very much.
Hello everybody, I'm just going to share my screen now and continue on with the presentation. I've got a couple of extra slides that I want to run through, and I'll get them up on the screen and we'll get on with this last part of the presentation. There is an opportunity obviously to ask questions, and I can see some people already asking questions at the end of this, so I'll try and get through these slides as quickly as I can. Just following on from where Tony left off, the key thing for any type of scheme where you're looking at your energy on campus is to make sure you start with a clean slate. Don't try and have a preconceived solution for your particular circumstance, because that can limit your options as you're moving through this process. And certainly when we were looking with Tony and Rob Oanshaw and others at the UC at the initial feasibility study stage of this project, we had a very wide range of solutions that were considered within the feasibility report itself. And we tried to make sure that we covered off as many different types of technologies, which included things like using electric boilers, using hydrogen fuel cells, solar hot water heating, solar PEV, and many others, as we were looking at how we could help UC remove their reliance on carbon technology for heating the campus. The other key thing to do is when you're comparing those technologies, make sure you set up some criteria to compare them that are easy to compare between different types of solutions, because each type of solution has obviously different criteria that it works to. And if you have a good broad range of criteria to compare, you can do a realistic comparison between operating costs, carbon reduction, initial capital expenditure, that kind of thing, that gives you a real opportunity to make sure you're picking the right solution for your particular circumstance. The other key thing for us is making sure you engage early with the industry, because there's a lot of experts in the industry and many of them are willing to help you on this journey. And we certainly found by talking to people like the fuel suppliers, like the equipment suppliers, and even the utility providers, that we were getting some really good inputs that we could put together into our reporting that gave a really good understanding of the marketplace that we were working in at the time. And things are changing frequently as well. So having those industry contacts will keep you much more up to date with what's going on with the technology, what's going on with the fuel types and the like, and allow you to adjust your approach as things change in the market, which they always do. And I think also consider the funding sources early. One of the things that helped us a lot with the University of Canterbury is ECA's funding. Two aspects to that. Firstly, they actually helped pay for the feasibility study, but equally they also helped UC implement metering across the campus. And one of the things for us was understanding how the campus was working. And it became very obvious that the campus is a very large and very complicated system. So having good information to base the decisions on around the fuel use in individual buildings or groups of buildings or on different parts of the campus allowed us to adjust our approach and our systems to meet those particular demands. And there's also opportunity to partner with people like the utility providers. There are some clients that we're working with at the moment that are partnering with their energy providers to deliver sustainable solutions for the campuses and buildings that they're working in. So there's plenty of alternative opportunities for your funding. And the other key things that certainly came out for us, and one of the things I want to probably talk a little bit more on, is the boundary conditions around the campus. There certainly are always going to be limitations. With the University of Canterbury, I think their role is around about 15,000 students and about 2,000 plus staff, so there's roughly 17,000 people on the campus. The buildings are very busy. Major projects within the buildings require those buildings to be decanted, and there's a lot of buildings on campus that are being heated at the moment. So if you're going to start looking at changing the heating solution that requires you to do work inside those buildings, then you've got to plan that work. It takes a period of time to do. One of the reasons that we ended up with a solution where we've got this interim use of biomass fuel in the boilers is to give the university time to update their buildings and change the systems in their buildings, rather than trying to go straight from coal to a ground source heat pump solution, which is what we'd identified as the preferred route. we needed to give some time, an interim step to allow some of the building upgrades that were needed. Building types, building use, the building performance. UC's got some, I think we call it legacy buildings on site, which are quite old and built to quite a different building standard to the current building code. Single glazed, very little, if any, thermal insulation in the facades, which meant they weren't really suitable for changing to something like a ground source heat pump solution that produces heat at a much lower temperature. And also there's issues around the site infrastructure, making sure you've got the right power supplies for an electric energy source in the right locations on the campus. That required some planning, and effectively what our feasibility study and the roadmap strategy report did in combination was produce a master plan for the transition from coal to electric ground source heat pumps. And it is a journey as well. It's a single step is probably not going to get this done on the larger campuses. So, and the changeover might be problematic. As I mentioned, you might need to do some building fabric upgrades. You might need to do some changes to heating equipment inside the buildings themselves. You might need to dig some trenches across the campus to run some new pipe work. You might need to drill some boreholes. So there's things that are going to have to happen that could be quite disruptive to the normal operations of the buildings that you're working in. And you need to make sure your stakeholders are aware of those issues so that they're not surprised when you turn up and start doing the work. And the other thing with UC in particular is it's an extended period of time to do this work. We don't have the option to empty the campus out, upgrade all the buildings, do all of the work in one phase. We need to give time to get that work done. Tony, I think I'll probably carry on talking through these slides if you're okay with that. This is another part of really the stakeholder engagement. Part of our feasibility reporting, we produced a comparison chart like this. This is where I'm talking about the comparison criteria. So you've got different types of technologies, how much carbon they will save and how much they will cost to provide that carbon saving. And this was one of the tools we used to identify where the big winners are. And if you look for the ground source, low temperature water source heat pumps, they're producing a big carbon saving, and the capital investment is quite low. So there is a real cost benefit to doing that. With the biomass, you're getting a big carbon saving again, and the costs are relatively low. When you start looking at things like large scale photovoltaics, the carbon reduction is quite low and the cost is quite high. So you get a reasonably good comparison of the different types of technologies and how they work against one another. And this allows you to make strategic decisions for the direction you want to travel. And Tony did mention this slide in his presentation. This is where we developed a traffic light system that basically compared some of the shortlisted technologies we thought were worth considering further, and we scored them against a number of criteria. So capital cost, life cycle cost, CO2 emissions, ease of integration, and fuel supply risk. So one of the things we identified with UC in particular is that their coal is the single supplier in New Zealand. And if that single supplier stops supplying that coal, they've no longer got heating. So an alternative fuel source was a key risk that they needed to cover off. And this, when we're looking at fuel supply risk, we looked at wood chip, wood pellet. The level of wood chips and wood pellets we would need was quite high. So we wanted to make sure that there was sufficient suppliers in the marketplace to deliver on that requirement. I'm flying through these slides, I'm sorry, because I know we're running out of time. This, I think we'll probably finish on this slide. This is our roadmap. So this is where we identified the starting position, identified the end goal, and what steps we thought we'd need to take along that journey. So you can see there's quite a number of steps that needed to be done. And it's really just trying to demonstrate to key stakeholders how much of a complicated journey this would be and when things will likely happen, and what steps they would need to take and where approvals were required, for example. And I think if I finish there. So
amazing.
Over.
Thanks, Steve. So running a bit late on time, so I'll just go through some of the questions in the Q&A box to ask our speakers. Just as a suggestion, Tony, Steve, and Graham, if you could just do some brief answers to the questions just so we can cover off as many questions as possible, that would be amazing.
Yeah,
First question is, Has the university set science-based target carbon reduction targets, or is the current reduction plan aligned with the climate science/Paris Agreement?
If I can say, we haven't specifically aligned with science-based targets, but we have the capability to be involved. In other words, the level at which and the nature of which of the reviews that we're conducting and the reductions that we've made make us capable of being part of that organisation. We haven't done it so far, I've got to say.
And someone says, thank you for your presentation, very informative. Are there certified training programs you can recommend for those new to sustainability, but already working in a full-time non-related sustainability role, where sustainability is an add function?
I would say most definitely. Sustainability is getting together with CEP, which was formerly EMANS. So it's the carbon and energy professionals. Now there you will obviously get a balanced view in terms of energy and carbon, and obviously with a view from a sustainability perspective. So yeah, it's the CEP, carbon and energy professionals. Go to their website. They are an excellent organisation. Good plug.
Great, thank you. And have you measured staff and student travel to the campus, and how? Someone asks about Canterbury. And have you been successful in implementing a plan that reduces staff air travel aside from pandemic restrictions, which is very helpful at present?
This is something we're working on. This is currently, bearing in mind we've got the pandemic, we've got the potential that's going to be endemic. We're working on this right now. We are back at a very low level of travel, but we do have work going on in the university at the moment that is looking at how we can perhaps identify a way forward that actually maintains the travel that's necessary, but obviously curtails that isn't. And so we're probably looking at a number of things. I suppose one of the ones that we are currently thinking about is something that would be more along the lines of cap and trade. So looking at individual component organisations, component colleges, etc., and then saying, right, okay, here's where you stand, here's where you sit, and here's what you can do to actually make some reductions, so they can effectively sort of sell off some of their family silver and obviously look big in front of the rest of the university. But yes, we're working on that. Yes, we're moving down that line. It is a very serious component in terms of our global, our greenhouse gas inventory.
Great, thank you. And Emma asks, did you have a good metering system in place per building for the feasibility studies, or did you do a high level review of it?
I'll probably answer that one. Initially, there was some meter data, but it wasn't for all the buildings. So we started with some high level assessments on the building loads. But what we've done over time is as UC has implemented more metering, we've checked our high-level assessments against the meter data as buildings were metered, and we've shown quite a good level of correlation between what we'd estimated and what the actuals were. So we started off estimating and ended up using meter data.
Yeah, I'd just add to that and say that we had a very comprehensive metering capability in terms of the electricity side of things, but obviously looking at the medium temperature hot water and the heat side of things, that's been built up quite considerably. But at the time that when Steve and I were sort of working over this, then obviously it was not in its infancy, but it needed to be built up. And of course we had building problems. We had subsequent metering problems that came out of those shakes. Unfortunately, they were very deleterious.
Great. And probably we'll just do the last question here because we're running out of time. I'm sure everyone has busy schedules. This is a good question looking towards the future a bit. Do you see the government in coming years imposing any mandatory net zero carbon requirements for private businesses as a follow-on from TCFD reporting once TCFD has been required for a few years and businesses are used to it?
Undoubtedly, I can't see that it's not. With size of organisations, obviously comes the responsibility. It equally, I suppose, it's incumbent upon those organisations to be pushing themselves rather than perhaps getting the pull from the government. That said, I don't believe that they can be sort of left to move along rather than be provided with certain incentives. Yeah, I do believe measure and manage.
Yeah, I'll just add to that as well. I think one of the things that's happened in other parts of the world with this type of thing is that the government has led the way and has started with things like setting standards for the buildings that they will occupy when they lease buildings from the private sector, saying it has to have a minimum level of carbon, carbon reporting or something like that, and that will kind of lead the private sector into doing that kind of work, and they will see the benefits, and they will, be able to charge premium usually for the higher performing buildings. So that's probably the way it would go.
The Energy Performance of Buildings Directive that came out of the EU. Yeah, undoubtedly.
Great, thank you. Well, I think we've run out of time, so sorry to those of you whose questions couldn't be answered, and thank you to our speakers, Tony, Steve, and Graham, and to everyone who's stuck around up until 11:01 today, 136 of you, well, 2 just dropped off. To those of you who aren't already signed up to our mailing list, you can sign up to that and you'll get updates to new webinars that are coming out and any trainings that we might have. And if you haven't started your carbon emissions reduction journey, you can absolutely reach out to me and we can have a chat about that as well. Thanks again to all of you, and thanks, and chat to you all soon.
Kenzie, could I just say something very quickly?
Yes, absolutely.
I just leave people with the thought that, we've got a really big problem. They're talking about code red, etc. But we can all be part of the solution. Let's push it. It's not rocket surgery. I can use the inaccurate. Yeah, let's get on and do it. We've got to. Thank you.
Definitely. There's hope. Thank you, everyone. Cheers.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.